Let's continue now with our exploration of the sonata cycle. This is a very important form, as we've seen, and now we're going to look at yet another way that we use this particular structure, and that is called the concerto. You may remember when we talked about Vivaldi's Four Seasons that was an example of concerto grosso, the big concerto where we had a small group of soloists plus an orchestra. By the time we get to the classical period, the concerto is mostly a solo event. So you would have a soloist, an instrumentalist, this is an instrumental genre, and an orchestra. In contrast to the sonata where we had a soloist and a piano or other keyboard type of instrument. So got to have a soloist who plays an instrument, you have to have an orchestra. If you don't see those two things, it's not a concerto, don't call it that. So we're still sticking within our sonata cycle form, but for the concerto we actually get rid of a movement. So we have our opening movement, which is usually our sonata allegro, and as we see through time, that first movement is often going to have a slow introduction to set us up for the excitement of the sonata allegro part. The second movement is going to be slow for our contrast. But instead of having that minuet and trio, or the scherzo and trio as it became later, as a third movement, we're going to throw that one out. And we're going to finish up with another fast movement at the end. So if you will remember that a concerto has a fast movement and a slow movement and a fast movement, then you'll have that covered. So what happens in a concerto? You have your orchestra, you have your soloist. Usually in the sonata allegro movement of that concerto, what happens is that the orchestra will start and they will play our first theme, second theme, all that stuff that happens in the exposition. They do the whole thing. Remember, we always repeat that. So when we go back to the repeat, that's often where the soloist joins us. So it's not going to be exactly the same because now we've got our solo instrument, whatever that is, playing the exposition with the orchestra. And then we have our development just as we would, and we have our recapitulation just as we would. Somewhere in there, maybe at the end of the development, maybe somewhere else, what often happens is what we call a cadenza. This is where the orchestra stops, completely stops playing. And the soloist will now dazzle us. And that might be dazzling us with a lot of notes, it might be dazzling us with just beautiful sounds. But what they're doing is taking bits and pieces of all those themes that we've already heard in the movement and combining them in new kinds of ways. This is why it works very nicely at the end of the development where we've already been doing that anyway. So you take it all together, you do some fancy flourishy things, throw in a few scales, rattle, rattle, rattle. When you get to the end of it, normally there's a big trill, and that tells the orchestra, oh yeah, pick up our instruments, it's time to play now. And then the orchestra comes back in for the finish. So that cadenza in Mozart's time, the period we're looking at, would often not even be written out. The soloist would have to improvise that because we're really not too far from that period of time when composers would have expected their performers to improvise anyway. Today, most of those concertos, cadenzas, have been written out. You know, somebody's done a really great one and they wrote it out for everybody else to play. So you might hear the same basic cadenza in multiple places. And then composers actually start writing their own cadenzas so they get the kind of cadenza they wanted from the performer anyway. But when you go, you'll know that it's a cadenza because everybody will stop, the soloists will do their thing, and then they will all join back in. So that happens a lot in the first movement and in the third movement. Don't hear it quite so much in second movements because those are nice, slow, lyrical, beautiful things. They don't really lend themselves to a lot of flashy, dramatic kinds of things. So in the classical period, we have a new instrument, and that is the clarinet. You'd think, well, has it really not been around any longer than that? No, it's relatively new. It's got some ancestors before that, but the instrument that we know as the clarinet comes around in the classical period. Mozart loved the clarinet. So he wrote a really lovely concerto for clarinet. So what we're going to listen to is the second movement of this particular concerto. It's obviously the slow movement, and it's beautiful. And Mozart just takes the clarinet and just lets it soar over the orchestra. So now I'd like you to go listen to the second movement of Mozart's clarinet concerto and just enjoy the beauty of this instrument that Mozart loved so much and that he gave this wonderful, wonderful piece of music to accompany.